Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack a truly wild piece of history. We're looking at how a single, completely disastrous battle back in 1578 actually birthed the world's very first global transoceanic superpower, and, crazy enough, a ghost story that lasted for centuries. We are going to explore the rise, the absolute ruin, and the deeply haunting legacy of the Iberian Union.
Right out of the gate, I want you to imagine something. What actually happens to a massive, global empire when its sovereign king literally vanishes into the desert without a trace? I mean, it sounds like a movie plot, right? But in the late 16th century, this very real mystery triggered a massive geopolitical earthquake. It merged the Spanish and Portuguese empires, entirely reshaped global trade, and created this intense, messianic myth that survived for hundreds of years.
So, to make sense of all this, we need to start at Chapter 1, the vanishing king, and the truly fatal disappearance.
To put it bluntly, Portugal was brought to its knees by a rapid cascade of disasters in just 3 short years. The whole thing kicked off in 1578 with a completely devastating military defeat in Morocco at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. After a very brief, incredibly desperate interim rule by an elderly cardinal, the powerful Spanish king, Philip II, swooped in to assume full control by 1581. But, how did it unravel so incredibly fast?
Well, it comes down to this. The 24-year-old King Sebastian I died on that Moroccan battlefield. He had mobilized this massive army full of crusading zeal, but the Moroccan forces just decisively routed them. Not only was the young king killed, but the Portuguese nobility was absolutely decimated. And here's the kicker. Because Sebastian had never married, he died childless. Basically, he left the keys to this massive empire completely up for grabs. The crown temporarily fell to his 66-year-old great-uncle, Cardinal Henry. But being bound by clerical vows, Henry obviously couldn't produce an heir either. So when he died in 1580, the Aviz dynasty faced a totally fatal succession crisis, leaving Portugal dangerously vulnerable to its opportunistic neighbors.
Which brings us directly to Part 2, the reluctant union, and what we call paper autonomy. Now, Spain's Philip II actually had the strongest blood claim to the Portuguese throne, but to secure it peacefully without a massive uprising, he had to make some huge concessions at the 1581 Cortes of Tomar, the Portuguese assembly. He agreed to a delicate paper autonomy. Basically, Portugal got to retain its independent laws, its coinage, its courts, and crucially, control over its own colonial administration. In exchange, Philip absorbed Portugal's global empire into his massive composite monarchy. So they were distinct, separate territories under a single ruler. This gave Spain unprecedented maritime reach and literally created the world's largest contiguous empire of its time.
And to seal the deal, Philip swore a highly solemn oath known as the Carta de Filipe. He promised, on paper, to respect Portugal's fundamental liberties and keep the realms perpetually separate. He was very careful to frame this arrangement not as a conquest of a weaker neighbor, but as a personal dynastic union. The crowns were united on his head, sure, but the countries themselves were not legally merged. And honestly, for a little while, this careful balancing act actually worked.
But as subsequent kings took power, those promises faded, leading us to our third chapter, an empire overstretched.
That delicate balance totally shattered with the heavy-handed union of arms policy introduced in the 1620s by the Spanish Count Duke of Alba. Facing massive, draining wars in Europe, the Habsburg monarchy suddenly demanded a centralized 140,000-soldier army to defend their shared empire. Overnight, Portugal, which had been explicitly promised military autonomy, remember, was expected to supply nearly 19,000 troops for Spanish conflicts. As you can imagine, Portuguese elites saw this as a blatant, unforgivable violation of their original agreement.
And if the human blood toll wasn't enough, just picture the financial cost. Between 1619 and 1632, the Portuguese parliament was forced to subsidize the Spanish war machine to the tune of 160 tons of silver. Let me say that again. 160 tons of silver. That's over 5 million cruzados. Portugal was literally being bled dry to fight European continental wars that served Madrid's interests, completely ignoring Lisbon's.
And by bleeding Portugal dry to fight those European wars, the Habsburgs left the incredibly valuable Portuguese colonies completely undefended. The Dutch West India and East India companies saw this vulnerability and, well, they pounced. The result was a string of catastrophic losses for Portugal. Ambon and the East Indies fell in 1605, the wildly lucrative sugar plantations of Pernambuco in Brazil were captured in 1630, and the strategic hub of Malacca was taken in 1641. Portugal's once untouchable global trade network was being systematically dismantled by Spain's rivals.
Ultimately, the Union was doomed by a total misalignment of priorities. While Habsburg Spain focused heavily on the 30 Years' War and maintaining their continental dominance, which resulted in a massive fiscal drain, the Portuguese Empire desperately just wanted to protect its Atlantic and Asian trade monopolies. But because Spain called the shots, Portugal's undefended outposts fell one by one. The geopolitical marriage had become incredibly toxic.
Eventually, something had to snap, and it did, in Chapter 4, the 1640 Revolution. Driven entirely to the brink by those crushing taxes and the loss of their beloved autonomy, 40 Portuguese nobles decided they had simply had enough. On December 1st, 1640, they staged a sudden, violently successful coup in Lisbon. They literally stormed the palace, assassinated the deeply unpopular Spanish-backed Secretary of State, and tossed him right out a window. With widespread popular support cheering in the streets, they proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as their new independent king, João IV, violently severing the 60-year union.
But declaring independence is one thing, right? Actually defending it is a whole different beast. To protect their reclaimed sovereignty against a naturally furious Spain, Portugal had to rapidly reorganize its military. They managed to raise a phenomenal force of nearly 38,000 professional and militia troops on the mainland. It was an absolute all-hands-on-deck mobilization of national resources, leaning heavily on local militias, combined arms, and some seriously fortified border positions.
What followed was the grueling Restoration War. It definitely wasn't a quick or easy victory. It took decades of brutal defensive border warfare. But eventually, Portugal secured massive, decisive victories at the battles of Amachial in 1663 and Montes Claros in 1665, totally shattering Spanish momentum. Finally, a financially ruined and militarily exhausted Spain yielded, signing the 1668 Treaty of Lisbon and permanently recognizing Portuguese sovereignty.
Yet the psychological scars of that 60-year union ran incredibly deep, bringing us to our final chapter, the myth of return. Even with their independence secured, the intense trauma of the Iberian Union triggered a massive cultural coping mechanism that we call Sebastianism. Remember young King Sebastian, who vanished in the desert back in 1578? Well, because his body was never conclusively identified by the masses, a powerful messianic myth took root. People firmly believed he didn't actually die. The legend promised that he survived in hiding and would one day emerge from the mists to save Portugal from its Spanish overlords and restore its lost imperial glory. And this wasn't just some fringe bedtime story either. During the absolute darkest, most oppressive days of the Iberian Union, multiple impostors actually stepped forward. Claiming to be O Encoberto or the Hidden One, these pretenders actively weaponized the myth. Throughout the 1580s and 1590s, they successfully used the memory of the vanished king to incite real, bloody rebellions against Spanish Habsburg rule. The people were just so desperate for a savior that they willingly followed these impostors right into battle. And fascinatingly, even after Portugal regained its independence, Sebastianism didn't die out. Over the centuries, the legend evolved from a political rebellion tool into a profound cultural expression of saudade, which is this beautiful, uniquely Portuguese word meaning a deep, melancholic yearning for something absent or lost. It shaped the literature, the nationalism, and the very identity of both Portugal and colonial Brazil for centuries. Even way later in the 17th century, Jesuit preachers over in Brazil were using Sebastianism as a symbol of redemption from imperial decline. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this thought to chew on. How does the psychological trauma of a lost national identity create ghosts that echo through centuries of culture? The Iberian Union fundamentally rewired global trade and redrew maps all over the world, for sure. But it also proved that sometimes the legend of a vanished king holds far more power than the reality of the empire he left behind. Thanks so much for exploring this incredible slice of history with me.